Picture a world already fully connected, long before anyone thought to call it that. Ships loaded with copper and tin crossing open water between ports that don't share a language. Kings writing letters to other kings, calling each other brother, negotiating marriages, trading gold for horses, complaining when a shipment arrives late. Scribes trained in 3 or 4 writing systems just to keep the correspondence moving. Palaces with indoor plumbing, archives of clay tablets, standing armies, chariots, glass workshops, purple dye industries worth small fortunes. A genuinely international age, 3,200 years ago, more interconnected than almost anyone realizes. And then, within the span of a single human lifetime, almost all of it burned. Not one city. Not one kingdom. Nearly every major power center across the eastern Mediterranean, one after another, in roughly the same 50-year stretch. Palaces torched and never rebuilt. Trade routes that had run for centuries simply stopping. Writing systems abandoned so completely that some would not be used again for over 400 years. Historians have a name for it now, the Late Bronze Age collapse, and even after a century of digging through the wreckage, nobody can fully agree on what actually happened. Tonight we're going to sit inside that 50-year stretch. Not rushing toward an answer, because there isn't a clean one waiting at the end. Just walking slowly through a genuinely interconnected ancient world, watching it come apart in real time, piece by piece, letter by letter, and sifting through the strange, scattered clues that survived the fire. If you're settling in to drift off, this is a good one to get lost in. There's no test at the end, just a very old mystery and a long, quiet night ahead of you. Let's start with the world before the fall, because you have to understand how sophisticated it was to understand how strange its ending really is. By around 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean functioned as something close to a single connected system. Egypt, under the New Kingdom pharaohs, controlled the Nile and reached north into Canaan. The Hittite Empire ruled out of a mountain capital called Hattusa, in what's now central Turkey, commanding much of Anatolia and pushing into Syria. Mycenaean Greece, the world later mythologized by Homer, ran a network of fortified palace centers, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Knossos on Crete, each one a redistribution hub taxing and organizing the countryside around it. Along the Syrian coast sat Ugarit, a merchant city so thoroughly plugged into international trade that its archives, written on clay in at least 5 different languages, read like the shipping manifests of a small but extraordinarily busy global port. Cyprus supplied much of the region's copper. Assyria and Babylon anchored the east. These weren't isolated kingdoms that happened to exist at the same time. They were bound together by something close to formal diplomacy. We know this because their letters survived, baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the palaces holding them. Clay doesn't burn, it just gets fired into permanence, which is its own small irony. In one cache, found at Amarna in Egypt, kings addressed the pharaoh as brother, ask after each other's health, negotiate the price of horses in gold, and occasionally complain, in tones that feel startlingly modern, about gifts that arrived broken or shipments that were late. Then there's the ship. In the 1980s, a sponge diver off the southern coast of Turkey, near a headland called Ulubran, noticed strange shapes on the seafloor about 140 feet down. What archaeologists eventually excavated was a merchant vessel from around 1300 BCE, and its cargo reads like a snapshot of the entire international system in one hold: 10 tons of copper and roughly a ton of tin, precisely the ratio needed to make bronze, ingots of raw glass in cobalt blue and turquoise, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber that had traveled thousands of miles overland before ever touching water, Egyptian gold jewelry, Canaanite pottery loaded with resin and olives, Cypriot pottery, Mycenaean pottery, a folding wooden writing board, and even a scarab bearing the name of an Egyptian queen. One ship, a dozen cultures, all of it moving as part of one working, breathing economy. Bronze itself is worth pausing on, because it's the material the entire age is named for, and it depended on something fragile. Making bronze requires copper and tin, mixed in careful proportion. Copper was reasonably available around the Mediterranean. Cyprus produced it in bulk. Tin was not. The nearest significant tin sources sat far to the east, in Central Asia, or far to the west, past Sardinia, possibly as far as the Atlantic coast. Every bronze sword, every plough fitting, every set of armor in this entire interconnected world depended on tin traveling enormous distances along trade routes that had to stay open, year after year, kingdom after kingdom, for the system to keep functioning at all. So imagine that system, rich, sophisticated, deeply interdependent, running on centuries-old momentum. Now imagine it stopping. If you've been enjoying tonight's slow walk through a forgotten world, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, especially if you're the type who likes falling asleep to something that quietly rearranges how you think about the past. And if you're still awake enough to type, I'd genuinely love to know in the comments what era of history keeps you up wondering. Medieval, ancient, prehistoric, doesn't matter, I read all of them. Now, quietly, back to the collapse. The destruction happened in waves, roughly between 1225 and 1175 BCE, and the sheer geographic spread of it is what makes archaeologists uneasy even today. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was abandoned and burned, and strangely, the royal archives had already been mostly emptied out before the fire, as if the people leaving knew exactly what was coming and took the most important tablets with them, wherever a way turned out to be. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for roughly 500 years, simply stops appearing in the historical record after this. Ugarit's ending is the one that tends to stay with people longest, because we have its final words. Among the clay tablets recovered from the city's ruins is a letter, still sitting unfired in a kiln, meaning it was never actually sent, baked into permanence only by the fire that destroyed the building around it. The king of Ugarit is writing to the king of Cyprus, and the message is close to this: enemy ships have been sighted at sea, they are burning our towns, our own fleet and army are away fighting elsewhere, please send help immediately. That letter was still in the kiln when the city burned. Ugarit was never significantly reoccupied. A city that had thrived as an international hub for centuries went silent in what may have been a matter of days. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean palace centers met similar ends. Pylos, on the Greek mainland, has yielded one of the richest archives of Linear B tablets ever found, precisely because the palace burned so thoroughly that the clay tablets, otherwise just sun-dried and fragile, were accidentally fired solid and preserved. Some of the very last records from Pylos describe watchers being posted along the coastline, bronze being collected for tools and weapons, and personnel being reassigned to guard duty. The palace was, by all appearances, bracing for exactly the kind of attack that then destroyed it. Mycenae and Tiryns burned as well. Knossos on Crete had already declined earlier, but the wider Minoan-Mycenaean world of grand palaces effectively ends here. Egypt came closest to survival, but not without a fight it documented in vivid, almost boastful detail. Pharaoh Merneptah records repelling an invasion around 1208 BCE. Then, under Ramesses III, roughly 1177 BCE, the date historian Eric Klein uses as shorthand for the entire collapse. Egypt faced what its own inscriptions describe as a coordinated invasion by land and sea simultaneously, carried out by a coalition of foreign groups the Egyptians lumped together under one term, the Sea Peoples. The Medinet Habu temple reliefs, carved to commemorate Ramesses III's victory, are startling to look at even now. They show a massive naval battle, Egyptian archers firing down into enemy ships from the shore while ships in the water capsize and fighters drown. But they also show something else, something armies don't usually bring with them: ox-drawn carts loaded with women, children, and household goods, moving alongside the warriors. This wasn't only a raiding party. Whoever these people were, they appear to have been migrating, entire displaced populations on the move, fighting as they went, looking for somewhere left to land. So, who exactly were the Sea Peoples? Here's where the certainty runs out, and where actual historians will happily tell you they don't know. The Egyptian inscriptions list names for the different groups: the Pele Set, the Tjeker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, the Weshish, among others. Scholars have tried matching these names to known peoples. The Pele Set are widely linked to the later Philistines, who settled the Levantine coast right around this time. The Shikalesh have been tentatively connected to Sicily, the Shurden to Sardinia, the Denyen possibly to the Aegean or Cyprus. But, tentatively connected, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. No Sea People's homeland, no single point of origin, no unified culture uniting them has ever been confirmed. The most honest current picture is that they weren't one people at all, but a shifting coalition of displaced groups, possibly pushed together by the exact same crisis they're often blamed for causing, refugees and raiders both, swept along by a system that was already coming apart underneath them before they ever showed up in an Egyptian relief. Which raises the real question historians have been circling for decades. Was this an invasion that caused the collapse? Or was it a symptom of a collapse that had already begun for entirely different reasons, with the Sea Peoples simply riding, and worsening, a crisis that was already well underway? Because the destruction layer doesn't stand alone. Underneath it, or running alongside it, sits a stack of other evidence, and depending which researcher you ask, any one of these could have been enough to bring the whole system down on its own. Start with the climate. Pollen samples pulled from lake beds and sediment cores across Cyprus, Syria, and the eastern Mediterranean point to a serious, multi-decade drought beginning right around 1200 BCE, one of the driest stretches the region had seen in centuries, arriving at precisely the wrong moment. A drought of that length doesn't just mean thinner harvests one bad year. It means famine building on famine, herds of animals dying off, palace grain stores, which were central to how these redistribution economies functioned, running critically low year after year with no relief in sight. Some researchers argue this alone could have triggered the unrest, the migrations, even the wars that followed, as populations found their home regions could no longer support them and started moving, by necessity, toward wherever still could. Then there's the ground itself. Geologist Amos Nur, working with historian Eric Klein, proposed what they called an earthquake storm, not one single quake, but a cluster of major earthquakes striking the region over a period of roughly 50 years, the natural result of accumulated stress along the fault lines that run through this part of the Mediterranean. Archaeological layers at multiple sites, collapsed walls, fallen columns, skeletons crushed beneath rubble, do show earthquake damage consistent with this window. An earthquake alone rarely ends a civilization. But an earthquake that flattens your granaries in the middle of a multi-year drought, while your trade routes are already straining and refugee groups are already on the move, is a very different kind of disaster. It doesn't need to be the single cause. It only needs to be one more blow landing on a system that's already buckling. And the system itself may have simply been too interconnected for its own good. This is the argument Eric Klein makes at length: these Bronze Age kingdoms weren't self-sufficient. They depended on each other, tightly and specifically, for materials that couldn't be produced locally, tin, above all, for bronze, grain, in bad years, shipped between kingdoms to cover shortfalls, even skilled scribes trained across cultural lines to keep the diplomatic correspondence flowing. When you connect that many systems that closely, you gain enormous efficiency and wealth in good years. But you also gain fragility, because a disruption in one place doesn't stay contained, it ripples straight through every partner depending on it. Cut the tin routes, and bronze production stalls everywhere at once. Disrupt one kingdom's grain shipments, and its neighbors, who'd come to rely on that surplus, suddenly find themselves short too. It's strikingly similar to how modern economists describe fragile, over-optimized supply chains today, brilliant under stable conditions, and one shock away from cascading failure. Historians increasingly favor exactly this kind of multi-causal picture: drought plus earthquakes plus famine plus migration plus warfare plus economic fragility, arriving together, each one worsening the others, rather than any single dramatic villain toppling the whole stage by itself. There's also a quieter theory, less dramatic but not necessarily less important, that the trouble may have started from within. Some historians point to signs of internal unrest. The palace-run redistribution economies of the Bronze Age were rigid, hierarchical, and demanding, extracting labor and goods from farming populations in exchange for centralized protection and organization. Under the added strain of drought and shortage, some researchers argue, that arrangement may simply have stopped feeling worth it to the people underneath it, and when a system loses the quiet cooperation of the population it depends on, it doesn't always take a foreign invasion to bring it down. Even warfare itself may have been shifting under everyone's feet. Historian Robert Drews has argued that this period saw a change in how battles were actually fought, a move away from small, elite forces fighting from chariots, which the old palace states were built around and highly dependent on, toward larger groups of mobile foot soldiers using new weapons and looser tactics, potentially including the earliest widespread use of javelins and long slashing swords. If true, the old chariot-based armies that had projected power for these kingdoms for centuries may have simply become obsolete almost overnight, against opponents fighting an entirely different kind of war. Layer all of this together and you start to see why collapse might be exactly the right word, and invasion might not be. Not one cause. Not one villain. A drought stretching for decades. Earthquakes rattling weakened cities. Trade routes for irreplaceable materials breaking down. Populations displaced and moving, fighting for a place to land. Old military systems failing against new tactics. Possibly unrest boiling up from within the very structures meant to hold society together. Any one of these might have been survivable on its own. All of them, arriving in the same 50-year window, reinforcing each other, that's a different kind of ending entirely. And the ending, once it came, held. This wasn't a temporary dark spell before things bounced back to normal. Across much of Greece, writing disappeared completely. Linear B, the script used by Mycenaean palace scribes, vanishes from the record for over 4 centuries. When writing reappears in Greece, it's a different system entirely, borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders, and it describes a strikingly different world, smaller settlements, simpler material culture, a population that archaeological surveys suggest may have dropped by as much as 90% in some regions. Historians call this stretch the Greek Dark Age, and it lasted roughly 300 to 400 years before the population, technology, and complexity of Greek society climbed back anywhere near what had existed before. Here's a detail that tends to sit with people quietly, long after the rest of the story fades. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, describe a legendary age of great kings, walled citadels, bronze armor, and a war fought at Troy. They were composed centuries after the collapse, passed down orally through generations who had no direct memory of the palace world they describe, only fragments, half-understood ruins, and stories reshaped by repetition across a genuine dark age. Some historians think the Homeric epics function almost like a folk memory of the world we've been walking through tonight, the real Mycenaean palaces, the real bronze-armored elite, the real collapse of an entire interconnected civilization, filtered and mythologized by people living in the rubble of a golden age they could see the remains of but no longer understood. It's not unlike the flood myths that echo across unrelated ancient cultures. The details blur and shift, but something underneath them may be an actual folk memory of something that really happened. Not every kingdom in the collapse simply vanished, and the differences are their own kind of evidence. Egypt survived, badly weakened and permanently diminished. Its era of dominating the region effectively ended even though the state itself endured for centuries more. Assyria, further east and somewhat insulated from the worst of the disruption, weathered the crisis and would later re-emerge as a major power. New arrivals settled into the vacuum along the Levantine coast, including groups increasingly identified with the Philistines, plausibly descended from sea peoples who never found a homeland to sail back to and simply stayed, becoming, generations later, someone else's neighbors, then someone else's rivals, in a story we're still telling today. What survived, oddly, was the deep memory of the collapse itself, scattered across cultures that experienced it from wildly different angles. Egyptian temple walls boast of victory even while quietly admitting the old world was ending. A Ugaritic scribe's last, unsent letter freezes one single moment of dawning panic in permanent fired clay. Centuries of Greek oral poetry preserve a hazy, golden memory of the palaces that had burned long before any of the poets were born. Different fragments of the same catastrophe, refracted through entirely different cultural lenses, each one telling only part of a much larger story that no single record fully captures. Which is really the honest place to leave this. We know, with real confidence, that the late Bronze Age world was extraordinarily connected, and that within about 50 years, nearly all of it came apart. We know drought, earthquakes, trade collapse, population displacement, and shifting warfare were all very likely involved, tangled together into something no single explanation covers cleanly. We don't know, and may never know with certainty, exactly where the sea peoples came from, why Ugarit's final plea was never sent, or what exactly it felt like to be a scribe at Pylos watching the coastline for ships that were already on their way. Every clean narrative offered up over the last century, barbarian invasion, natural disaster, systems collapse, internal revolution, turns out, on closer inspection, to only be part of the picture. The truth appears to be some tangled combination of all of them, arriving together, at the worst possible moment, for a world that had grown too interdependent to absorb the shock. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending a quiet hour with a 3,200-year-old mystery. If tonight's story is the kind of thing that helps your mind go quiet, subscribe for more evenings like this one, forgotten catastrophes, half-buried civilizations, the strange corners of history nobody quite finished explaining. And if you're still listening, tell me in the comments which detail stuck with you most, the letter still sitting in the kiln, the ox carts rolling in beside the warriors, or the 400 years of silence that followed. I read every one. Somewhere in the ash layer beneath a dozen modern countries, the record of that world is still sitting there, fired hard by the very fires that ended it, waiting for someone with a trowel and a lot of patience. The rest of it, the parts that never got written down, the ships that never made it home, the people who simply walked away and kept walking, that part is gone for good, the way most of history eventually is. Sleep well.